healthy discs and understanding what the discs are actually doing when the spine is moving. And I always encourage our students and our members to visualize the spine, to visualize the body moving, to visualize the anatomy. And when you're actually inside the body with your mind and you're able to visualize it, you will know what feels comfortable and what doesn't. And there's very different schools of thought on actually training people with disc issues. But if you understand what's happening in the spine, you'll be a little bit more sensitive to it. My opinion is always rather safe than sorry, because I've had clients with tremendous symptoms and clients with absolutely no symptoms. But if I know that there's something happening inside the body that is not quite kosher, then I'm going to train them for better alignment and better movement. The one big thing about training spines is not to create a static, stiff spine. You want your client to be able to perform their daily movements. They might come to you and say, oh, I'm not allowed to do this and I can't do that. And when you look at what they do on an everyday basis, you see that they're already doing all of that. So when you're teaching your client how to better take care of their spines, you have to give them an awareness. And I absolutely love the idea of a balloon and 2 paper plates. And the paper plates are obviously mimicking the vertebra, very thin ones might I add, and we know that they're not that thin. And the balloon is mimicking the disc. So when your client is busy moving around, I want you to be able to visualize what that disc is doing. So I'm going to call it over here. So one of the most important things is, if she had to lie on her back now, and I'm going to ask her to lie in a neutral pelvis, with her head down, which means we've got a fairly neutral spine. As soon as, and I want you to imagine that this client has a posterior bulge. In other words, it's going towards the floor now, okay? So I'm going to flip it over because this is how her vertebra is now. She's got a posterior bulge, and you ask her to tuck the pelvis through. She's going to increase that bulge posteriorly. So she's going to come back to neutral. So she starts with a slightly posterior bulge, and then she goes and presses the back down, and she increases that bulge to the back. Now, if she has symptoms, this is going to feel really uncomfortable, because remember, a posterior bulge bulges towards the spinal cord. If we can encourage her to come to a more neutral position and possibly do a little bit of extension, it'll just open that anterior part of the disc and make it feel a little bit more comfortable. If she has an anterior bulge, so now it's bulging this way, all right? So she's got an arch in her back. I ask her to lift her right leg up to 90 degrees, and I give her no cues, so she lifts the right leg up, and she increases that arch in the back, and she increases that bulge in the front. I then say lift the other leg up to 90 degrees, and she increases it even more. The more she trains like this with that anterior bulge, the more risk she creates on that annulus fibrosis, which is surrounding the disc. And then when it starts tethering, there's no wonder, because her movements are compromising the safety of the disc. But how can I cue her to do that a little bit differently? So she's going to place her legs down. So let's say she's still got that anterior bulge. I'm possibly going to ask her to just press the back down a little bit and try and bring that disc to neutral for her. I'm then going to encourage her to activate abdominals. Lift the right leg up to 90. Now you need to make her aware, because she's still got it like this, that the abdominals are holding on, the opposite oblique is holding on, no arch is going to happen in the back. And she's going to lift that other leg up to 90 with no arch. So I've stabilized that disc. If she lifted that second leg up and all of a sudden gave me an arch, she would do the same thing to the disc that it's already doing, which is that anterior bulge. Place both legs down. If she goes on her hands and knees, so now she's on her hands and knees, and here's the vertebra, and there's the disc. Let's say she's an anterior bulger, so now this is reversed. So she's bulging anteriorly, which means she's got an arch in her back. Alright, there we go, she's going to drop it even more. Nice. Now you ask this client to do a plank. So she extends the one leg back. She keeps that arch and she extends the other leg back. And she puts so much pressure on that back and on that disc. But we can cue it differently. So she comes back to that central position. We cue her to get the abdominals to pull that pubic symphysis through. So I can get that disc to a neutral position. And then, because she's that anterior bulger, I can even ask her to give me a slight posterior tilt. So I press the disc a bit more posteriorly. This is a bit more comfortable. She's going to extend the right leg back. I'm going to cue abdominals to keep that disc position. She's going to extend the left leg back, and I need those abdominals to keep that disc position so she knows what's going to keep the safety of that disc for her. She's going to hold that there. When she comes down, she still holds abdominals and then places the other leg down. Now, if she is a posterior bulger, so she's bulging it up, she likes doing that, I'm going to ask her to just stick her tailbone out a little bit so that I bring her more to a neutral position. Normally, when they hover their knees off and they're going to round their back, they're going to increase that bulge posteriorly. And if this is a client where it's pressing towards that spinal cord, it becomes really uncomfortable for some of them. So I'm going to ask her to place it down. I'm going to ask her to lead up with a coccyx, so we get to that neutral point again. She's going to lead the knee lift with a coccyx. Lift it off. The back extensors are going to kick in there a little bit. And she's going to have that disc feel like it's a little bit more central, which is what we want. If she arches her back, we take it to that anterior bulge. If she curves her spine, we take it to that posterior bulge. So when we're in neutral, we bring it to that central point. And that's just that sweet spot for that disc. So she's going to stay there again, inhale. Lead up with a coccyx, hovering it off. Keep and hold it. So there we're getting that even amount of work where we've got the abdominals firing up, we've got a little bit of hip flexors, we've got the back extensors kicking in slightly as well because she's not in a flexed lumbar spine. She's in that neutral position, and that's just like a happy place for that disc. Lie on the back for me, please. So now you've got these discs that are playing all over the place. And I want you to think of the different spines that you get. Because when you read various literature and books, you'll always tend to see how much flexion you have in your lumbar spine, how much extension you have in your lumbar spine, but you get different spines. Some clients have spines that are structurally tighter. The ligaments are tighter. The anterior and posterior longitudinal ligaments don't allow for a lot of play in the spine, so it doesn't allow the discs to move as much as a flexible spine does. But remembering that the discs are attached to the vertebrae, so they're not slipping in and out between the vertebrae. But that spine that is structurally tighter will have discs that are playing less in between the vertebrae. And that's important because if you put everybody's spine in the same box, you're not going to assess them the same and you're not going to train them the same. I want you to be able to separate those spines and say you have a structurally tighter spine, and have you seen that clients whose spines are structurally a little bit more tighter than others have less pain in the discs and often less issues. But if you take that spine and you start moving it around, you could irritate it. And now you have the discs doing the things that they're not accustomed to doing, and they start getting really irritated. So in this position, she's over here. And now I'm going to ask her to maintain that neutral position. Okay, so she's got that neutral position. I'm going to get to your questions right now. Let me quickly go through this, and then I promise I'm going to get to the questions. So, she's got a neutral spine now, and a neutral pelvis, because there's a difference between the two. She can have a neutral pelvis, but she can change her spine into a chest lift. But the pelvis actually stays neutral. But a neutral spine means the pelvis and the spine is in her neutral position. So now the disc is happy. She's going to inhale there. IQ, based on who she is. If she's a posterior bulger, I'm going to ask her to lift that lumbar spine off the mat and give me 10 to 15% activation of the back extensors, because she can do that. She can activate them herself. She's going to maintain that lift and just bring that disc to that beautiful neutral position, and then lift that right leg up to 90 degrees. Holding on. Now, you're going to encourage her to keep that small space in that lower back, because she's a posterior bulger, and I want to get her to that neutral sweet spot. Abdominals hold. I want you to change legs mid-air. Nothing changes. So this is the initial training to teach the client how you can maintain stability in the lumbar spine, protecting the disc while you load the back using the legs. And the levers are quite short. Place both legs down for me. If she is an anterior bulger, so now she's lying on her back and the disc is bulging up like this, I'm going to encourage her to just press the back down towards the floor slightly, but not by using the feet, because I'm going to be lifting the feet. So I want her to be aware that the abdominals are going to pull the pubic symphysis through and just take that disc from that anterior bulge to a more neutral position, and maybe even slightly posterior, because I know there's less risk of her going into an anterior tilt if I put her in a slight posterior tilt. So she's going to inhale there. Exhale, abdominals activate, maintaining the spinal position of the right leg up to 90 degrees. Inhale. Exhale, changing legs in mid-air with that slight posterior tilt for her. And switch it over again. Every time she switches, I want that abdominal activation. And she switches it again. And when you see that your client is coping really well, I'm going to ask her to bring both legs up. Left hand in front of her left knee. So this is going to encourage abdominal activation. She's going to press this left hand into that left knee. Her abdominals are holding on. She's going to straighten that right leg to 45 degrees. Now she's maintaining that lumbar spine position and bring it back in. If they struggle, you bring the knee closer to them and you have them press there. But remember, the closer you bring the knee with the posterior bulge, the more they like bulging. So we try and keep that neutral position. What does that mean? That as the knees come closer to her, she has to dissociate in her hips. So we're doing hip dissociation, which is not a bad thing. So she's going to keep this knee closer to her, press the hand into the knee into the hand, and straighten that leg away. Now she's teaching her spine that it can stabilize when those legs are moving in and out and away from her. And you're going to look at the difference between the two legs when they do this. So you're encouraging abdominals, holding that pubic symphysis as it reaches away. Bring it back, switch over to the other side. We press it in. If she's an anterior bulger, so it's bulging up, I'm going to ask her to press it back down just slightly as she presses this leg away and brings it in. If she's a posterior bulger, so presses out towards the mat, I'm going to ask her to maintain that small lift as she gently presses that leg away and brings it back in, and reaches it out and brings it back in. Control it down. Those are lower load exercises where you're getting the client to be able to do these movements without all the play happening in the spine. That doesn't mean that we want to create stuck spines. It just means that we want to create stability in the spine so that when it starts moving, they have this involuntary stability and awareness of how they can control that pelvis. Because when that pelvis is shifting, the lumbar spine is changing, and that's super important. Let me quickly get the first question, and then I'll continue. What is the
How
question?
about someone with one hip higher with the right side anteriorly tilted?
Oh, okay, so we're talking hips. So, right side higher, so you can stand up for me. So she's got a right side higher hip, turn to face it. Here we go, right side higher hip. So first of all, I want you to think that if the right hip is higher, she's got her vertebra on the right-hand side coming closer together. So there we're getting a slight lateral bulge. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong there, and it doesn't mean that it's got any tethering or there's any sequestration. It just means that there's a slight bulge over there. As soon as she does an anterior tilt as well, she gets that lateral bulge and a little bit of a posterior bulge because we've got the vertebra pressing in the front and pressing on the side. So that's normally where you would get a lateral posterior bulge happening in the disc. So now, when you have a lateral bulge, so let's say for example she's got that right hip higher, take your feet a little bit further apart. I want you to do something for me. So she's got that lateral bulge, alright? So it's to the left-hand side, okay? Or what side do you say is higher? The right. There we go. So the right-hand side is higher. So she's squeezing it on the right-hand side because the hip is coming closer and the vertebra is coming closer. So that bulge is happening to the left-hand side. You're going to lean over to the right-hand side, please, so to the higher side. Now I want you to see what that disc is doing. So it's going further, and then bring it back up. If she's got that higher hip on that side, and these two sides are close to each other, and she leans over to the left-hand side, look what happens to that disc. It's like, ooh, I like this. This feels good. Maybe not in such a big range, though. Maybe reduce that range slightly. But if you've got that higher hip, so let's say this is the hip part, because this is the lower vertebra, it's lifting it up, it's squeezing that side, it's bulging this way, and she starts moving towards that higher hip, it bulges it more. But when she comes and moves slightly over to the other side, it starts flattening it out a little bit more. So now you're taking that disc from being squashed on this side and bringing it to a more neutral position when you start reaching to the opposite side. Imagine how discs develop and have these problems. Yes, next question.
If a client hasn't had, I'm assuming this is MRI, but you suspect a bulging disc, what are the symptoms and protocol?
So first of all, some people don't have any symptoms, so that's the big thing. So some people are walking around with bulging discs and they actually have no symptoms at all. And it also depends on which direction it's bulging. If it's bulging laterally, it can definitely be irritating nerve root to nerve. If it's bulging posteriorly, it can definitely be irritating nerves as well. As soon as there's anything that's irritating nerves, you're going to get neural referral or neural pain happening from the area where the bulge is. So if it's lower back, you're going to get it into your legs and so forth. But when you think there is a bulge, you definitely want it to be diagnosed. However, the safest option always is you can lie your back. If I'm suspecting that something is wrong, because they've either got numbing or constant pain, because sometimes we think it's lower back, but it could be piriformis, it's irritating sciatica, so there's a lot of different variables that can be happening here. But it's always good to go back to the basics. And when you explain that to the client, they are willing to go that route with you. Another interesting thing is, when we have irritated discs and there are symptoms, and maybe there's even a little bit of nerve irritation, when you do deep core contractions, it actually makes it feel worse for some clients. So there's been quite a few situations where we don't do any core activation. We don't say inhale, exhale, abdominals, hold, bracing, corset effect, pelvic floor pulling up. We don't do any of that. And when we do those sessions where we take that element out, they often feel better afterwards. But when we're in a situation where we're thinking that there is something wrong, you're actually going to test various positions for your client. For example, so Connie's going to have her arms next to her. I'm going to put her in neutral pelvis. I'm going to ask her how that feels. If that feels good, then I'm going to ask her to start hinging the pelvis up, not tucking. How does that feel? She didn't go into extension. If she goes into slight extension, I'm going to say, how does that feel? If she says uncomfortable, then I know, oh, extension often feels uncomfortable with somebody who has symptoms with an anterior bulge. So she's going to hinge it back down. If I ask her to tuck the pelvis through, I'll ask her how that feels. And if she says, oh, that feels super uncomfortable. Often, a posterior bulging disc feels uncomfortable when you go into flexion in the spine. So it's not that they have it, but you're trying to create a program around what you're assuming. But it's always better to get a diagnosis. So if I'm thinking that somebody's got something, I will always refer them on to actually go and get a diagnosis. But if they're feeling it there and it's uncomfortable, I'm going to focus a couple of sessions, maybe a month or two, on really getting them stronger in that neutral position where they feel comfortable. Because when I get them stronger in this position, with those things that I did earlier with her, when we lift the one leg up and place it down and changing legs and so forth, and maybe then putting them on a foam roller to test stability, hands and knees, coming up and down, keeping neutral, I can then start incorporating other movements when they start feeling better. Because we can't have a neutral spine or a stuck spine forever. So we're going to have to start incorporating those movements. When you work in conjunction with a physical therapist or a physiotherapist, it makes it so much easier. Because they're also doing work on the clients to be able to get them to move easier, to be able to get that disc to just really get back to where it used to be. And that makes the programs a lot easier for you to work with. However, if you're unsure, always rather safe than sorry. So if she tucks her pelvis and it feels uncomfortable, I'm going to avoid movements that do that, which includes, stand up for me please, rolling down through her spine. Because that might feel really uncomfortable for her, because if flexion of the lumbar spine is uncomfortable, that's going to be uncomfortable as well. Come back up for me, and I'm going to teach her to be able to just pick things up for now with a hinge forward in her spine until she feels comfortable to do that flexion again. Lie flat on the back. If she's uncomfortable in flexion, I'm also going to avoid, when I start training them, straight legs. Arms straight up, roll up for me, please. That movement over there is getting that disc to really just press back as she rolls down, and it doesn't like that. So I'm going to avoid that. So that just means I'm going to take that exercise out of it altogether. I would rather do something like sitting up for me, please. Arms behind you, 45 degrees on the mat. Extend the back, straight legs down. There. Hover your right leg just off. Maintain the lumbar back position because I'm getting that work happening in the abs. And when they get stronger, you can even have them have their arms straight out in front of them. But I'm getting the work in the abdominals because of that hinge. I'm getting the hip flexion, and I'm avoiding that posterior tilt and that tuck and that flexion in the spine. Yes.
Next question. How can we know about and rehab rotated discs?
How can we what?
How can we know about and rehab rotated discs?
So again, the same thing applies. Whenever we're looking at discs that are uncomfortable or discs that are bulging in any direction or discs that are moving, always go back to a more neutral position. Start them off with the basics first. You always want to go back to the basics. And they're going to give you feedback along the way for all of that. Simple things like sit sideways for me, please. Sideways, yes. One leg bent. I'm going to come up for me completely. So up, yes, there we go. And bend this leg behind you. Right. So you can actually work the torso in a neutral position very easily. You've just got to become really creative on this. So you're going to reach this arm straight out in front of you. There we go. Hold that. You're going to gently lift this arm off of the mat. Hold that. So now she's already working into her oblique. I'm going to ask her to shorten that side. There we go. So again, another way to get them to start working in a neutral spine. And once you have them getting stronger in the neutral spine, that's when you can start testing various movements with them. But always go right back to the basics and start them with that neutral pelvis. See whether the tuck is uncomfortable. See whether the extension is uncomfortable. See whether the lateral flexion is uncomfortable. Again, remember, not everybody has symptoms. Yes. Last question, and then you have to go.
Do we see severe disc issues in the thoracic as we do in the lumbar?
So very interesting that you say that. So years ago, I had a client that I was taking for quite some time. She was very mobile and she was pregnant. She wasn't pregnant when I saw her the first time, but I knew her body really, really well. And when she was training with me, I said to her, because now we know what happens when you're pregnant and get this laxity and all the rest. I said to her, I need you to focus on your thoracic spine because you're really becoming kyphotic and you have that mobility and that flexibility. And I'm afraid that you're going to end up having some kind of disc issue later. And it was exactly that. Do you know what happened? About 5 months into her pregnancy, she said, I'm so tired, I'm overwhelmed with work, and I really want to exercise, but I just can't get to it right now. So she stopped. And unfortunately, she continued on for another 4.5 months with her pregnancy, with this kyphotic spine that just increased and increased and increased, and she got a posterior bulge. So when you're looking at bulges in the thoracic spine, I want you to think of what the most natural movement is for the thoracic spine that the majority of the population gets into, which is that flexion in the spine. So when you're stuck in that flexion in the spine and it's constant, there's a bigger chance of that posterior bulge happening in the thoracic spine. And whenever there's a posterior bulge, you've got to remember, a posterior bulge goes backwards towards the spinal cord. So that's why we don't want to go towards the spinal cord. If I had to choose, let's say anterior, you always want to encourage that extension in the thoracic spine to avoid that, especially with your hyperkyphotic clients. But the moral of today, and the lesson for today, is I want you to be able to understand what the discs are doing in the body. I want you to be able to visualize it, and I want you to take a couple of steps back, be less fancy in your sessions, and rather do an exercise program that takes them back to the foundation, that takes them back to the basics, and build up from there. Because when you're in those basics, you can start loading the spine a little bit more. And then we get things like that. Because now we're doing the basics, but we start loading the basics to get the spine to feel like it has the strength and it is safe. So say, for example, Carly had a posterior bulge, so discs. Gosh, I need to hurry up. So she had a posterior bulge, and it was like that. The last thing I want you to do is hold that weight, flex the spine down with that weight, and increase that bulge. What I do want to do is come back up. I want to teach you how to flex at the hip, hinge forward, there we go, with that neutral position. But I'm going to encourage her, because she's got this and we're loading it, to get the feeling that she can just kind of a little bit more activate lumbar extensors. I actually want that with a posterior bulge, but without letting everything hang over here. I do want that activation, okay? If she's an anterior bulger, so it's actually going like this, and she's sticking her arm out, she's in that anterior tilt, and she goes forward, I want you to visualize what's happening. So I take that disc, she sticks it out, and I press it more anteriorly as she sticks that thumb out. So I'm going to ask her to activate abdominals to pull that pubic symphysis through, and when she does that, I give her the awareness. Do you know how you're going to protect your spine now? Because we've established you've got this anterior bulge. I want you to be aware that when you go down, you've got that abdominal control in the front, because it's going to pull that pubic symphysis through, and then you're not going to get that huge arch in the back. And you can even stay there and give me a slight posterior pelvic tilt if you're an anterior bulger. So I can get these back extensors to work because they're working against gravity now. But I'm not moving the spine yet. Look at that, it's working like that. So as she gets stronger and as she feels like, oh, I actually feel like I can do these movements, and I've developed a mind-body connection of hip dissociation, because that's exactly what she was doing there now. When I've developed the mind-body connection of hip dissociation, I can start loading it. And I'm going to see how she feels with load. And then you start testing it. What if we flex it a little bit? What if we extend it a little bit? How does it feel? Because at the end of the day, we want them to be able to move in normally and at their own pace. It's as simple as that. So I hope that helped you. I wanted this really just wants to go all over the place. I wanted to tell you we're so excited. We launched our 6-level success path in the Education Hub that takes you from level 1, which is functional anatomy and biomechanics. Level 2 is client assessment and teaching skills. Level 3 is training various joints. Level 4 is training pathologies. Level 5 is special populations. And level 6 is business development. And it's all in the Education Hub right now. It tracks your progress as you go. And you're going to learn our spinal stability protocol in there in level 4. and you'll be able to see how far you are, and you'll be able to choose your favorites and redo them. So I hope that helped you, and you're welcome to email us any questions at tellmemore@of-courseonline.com, or you can go straight to the website, which is www.of-courseonline.com. Until next week, have a fabulous week further. Thank you so much, Connie. Take care. How's that?
That was